Well, greeting pastors and administrators across Southern Africa. My name is David Raj. I'm the founder and executive director for the South African Institute for Church Administration. It's my honor and privilege to have Dave Reed with us from The Guardian. And today we are having another installment on talking about the importance of compliance, and particularly in the area of protecting our children that comes to our respective churches. What an important topic that we're going to talk about. Dave, what I like about Dave, he's a missionary, he's passionate about God's kingdom, he's a pastor, but over the last few years he's also transitioned into consulting and working for The Guardian, where they focus primarily serving schools and churches in helping these organizations to be above board and to comply to the Child Protection Act. And there's quite a lot that sits within that. But in the next few 5-10 minutes, Dave will unpack that a little bit.
Sure.
Dave, what is the Child Protection Act? Just holistically, for our layman people out there, what does it mean? And
so essentially, the Child Protection Act is one of the things we consider when looking at protecting the children in our care. We've also got to look at the Sexual Offenders Act. There's a few different pieces of law that feed into what we do to protect the most vulnerable. And when we say children, essentially we've got to get quite a clear understanding of what that means in terms of age parameters. So with churches, a lot of the time, there's a chief concern around the Sunday school or the children's ministry, but there is a little bit of neglect in the youth space. But what we need to understand is under 18 is really the parameter that we look at in terms of keeping children safe, because that's the definition of a child under the age of 18.
Okay. So Dave, just again, so the Child Protection Act, right? It's a legislation that it's quite broad. Is the church responsible? Is there an onus upon the churches, upon senior pastors, when children comes under their care on the Sunday or on the Friday night youth? Is it our responsibility to ensure the safety of those children? Yes or no?
Yes, it is. Absolutely. Okay. And the way it plays out most practically is in who are we putting in front of the children? Who are we giving responsibility to take care of children? One of the chief concerns in the child protection or safeguarding space is the idea of the duty of care. And duty of care, when it's if you have a youth ministry or if you have a children's ministry, you're placing the responsibility of the care to often volunteers, people that and sometimes within the most church youth ministries, we're having children taking care of children.
Yes.
Or they're young adolescents taking care of children. But in terms of the Child Protection Act, we have to act responsibly regardless if they're employees or volunteers. So the law is quite specific in terms of that space, and one of the very specific things comes down to the background checks. The checks that we have to have in place for all volunteers, staff, people that we essentially trust their duty of care to a child, so under the age of 18.
Thank you, Dave. So here we're hearing the importance of that. There's an obligation on us as church leaders, as spiritual leaders, to when children comes under our care, whether we run an ECD, a school, a Christian school, but more importantly in this context, children's ministry and youth ministry, that there are certain protocols in place. In your reference to The Guardian, you refer to safeguarding. What is safeguarding?
So let me unpack it a little bit for you, because it's one of those misunderstood terms. Because I work with schools, we work in sport, we work in obviously churches, and looking into the future, wherever we have vulnerable people, they need to be safeguarded. And I often get put together with health and safety guys. I'm not a health and safety person. So just to give you a broad understanding of what the health and safety is, everything we put in place to mitigate risk from environment. Safeguarding is everything we put in place to mitigate the risk of a relationships going wrong.
Okay.
So when we talk about that, what we, on the safeguarding side, strictly speaking, safeguarding is the proactive or the preventative measures we put in place to avoid abuse happening to those that are in our care. Child protection, on the other side, in strict terms, is actually what happens once we have an identified case of harm or a child that is at extreme risk or posed, they're incredibly vulnerable by the makeup of their home, or they've come across some form of abuse. So that's a child protection. So safeguarding preventative, child protection reactive, essentially.
Okay. In layman terms, I mean, for a church, I mean, we want to create an environment on the Sunday. Once that child is handed over to the volunteer leader, that environment is safe.
Yes.
That the child is experience safety from the interaction they have with the leaders and so forth. That's in essence that we want to ensure.
Yes.
Okay.
So if I could just give some color to that, in my experience with this, obviously been involved with churches quite a bit, what often happens in the volunteer space is we'll take anybody who's willing to put their hand up and not necessarily trained or experienced or have skills to be able to take care of children. So we put bodies in rooms because they're willing and they seem motivated to be in that space, but they're not necessarily trained to be able to do that effectively. So we run risks by putting people that are not trained or don't have the right acumen of abuse happening in that space with classroom management or the way they deliver the program or their pressure to make it look a certain way. There is a high likelihood of abuse happening if people aren't properly skilled and they're just willing to be helpful.
Sure. I mean, we're talking to a group of churches from all walks of life, from urban churches to rural churches, to mega churches, to denominational churches, different settings, and our goal is to serve you. What, in terms of best practices, what advice can you give to senior pastors in things that they need to consider? I mean, there's this Sexual Offences Act, registration of children, police clearance of volunteers. Just I mean, there's a 3-day course that you need to go through, but in a few minutes, just some best practices you would recommend to our pastors out there.
So I think first to speak to what I was alluding to earlier, it's having the right people in the room that is the chief concern. And obviously there's the consideration around the background checks. Not only by law we're actually required to be checked against the Sexual Offenders Register and the Child Protection Register, but also the background checks in terms of references. So if we have someone joining our community, coming from another community, wanting to volunteer in that space, it's essential we do those background checks, because although we have that legal requirement from those two registers, there are challenges in that space in terms of how people get onto the register. So that due diligence that we do in terms of checking where they come from, do they come with references, and phoning those references and just checking, you know, what was the context that they left the previous church in. And these are sometimes awkward conversations, but very necessary conversations, because we can't simply rely on those two registers, because, for example, the Child Protection Register, to get a result back from that can take anything from 10 months to a year. So there's a long process of getting accurate information from that, whereas to pick up a phone and phone the person. So in terms of the background of the person joining our community, if they're going to be volunteering in the kids space, we have to be really diligent in that space. The second thing in terms of the right person is, are they properly equipped and trained to do the job?
Okay.
And that's where I think what I see a lot of churches doing, there's a lot of attention to the curriculum. What is our focus? We do themes, we do all the content is taken care of, but the delivery is left up to person by person.
Okay.
And that presents a challenge.
Sure. I want to pause there again. It's, I mean, as church leaders, we are a voluntary organization.
Yeah.
And I mean, the barrier to entry as a volunteer is, in my opinion, is very, very low.
Yes.
You know, whoever is available to serve, because there's always a shortage of volunteers to serve in this space. Now we're putting another barrier, and I think it's a very important barrier check that needs to be done. And so I want to just reinstate, pastors, it is very, very important in the interest of the children that we are meant to take care of. it's important that you do those background checks. And at the end of this presentation, we'll provide a little bit more information to assist you in terms of all the various policies and procedures that is needed.
Yeah.
In your experience in dealing with churches, do you want to elaborate a little bit more? In your manual, you talk about the different approaches, proactive approaches. Do you want to briefly just touch on that?
The proactive, we do have essentially quite a few things we say are baseline level as a foundation for getting the safeguarding, and that's the preventative in place. First thing, policy is a key concept, and policy that's actually functional and looks more like standard operating procedures. So there's, in most safeguarding or child protection policies, there is the philosophy side, which goes into roles and responsibilities, definitions, all that. That's quite consistent across different institutions. But where it becomes very specific for church per se, or each church, their culture dictates how they do things. So you can't just you download a policy or get ChatGPT to do a policy and then just, because it doesn't fit into that context. Into that context. For example, if you have, and the best practice is moving towards child-specific bathrooms. Not many churches have that luxury at the moment, but then we have policy or procedure. How do we deal with the toileting moment for really young children?
Wow.
And it's really dependent on the facility. But again, there's not a lot of legislation governing the proactive side of things. That's just best practice, and for us, moral responsibility to protect those in our care. Okay, so the bathroom moment, what is it? And it gets down to, if I have a 3-year-old and they need help in the bathroom, who's doing that?
Wow.
Because then there's a challenge in that space. If I have to clothe the child or get involved in that space, I've got to be properly trained or equipped, or at least there's best practice in the church context, the parents involved.
Yeah. Wow.
But there needs to be policy that governs our practice.
Okay.
And I've done a lot of work with schools, etc., on policy and churches with policy. And essentially, where we get to is we spent a lot of time thinking about how we're going to do something. Our policy defends our thinking. It's almost the defense line for our intellectual property.
Correct. Because
we spend so much time deciding how we're going to do this well. If there's a change of a guard, or we have new staff coming on, or new volunteers coming into place, if they're familiar with the policy, that's protected their thinking.
Yeah.
So we've defended all the work that we've done and figured out what's the best way to do that. But also saying that needs to be fluid, because we realize we make mistakes in that space, and that's why we review policy.
Sure.
So policy would be the first.
Yeah.
Then we do have someone within the organizational institution that's properly trained to safeguard and lead safeguarding as a concern, but also be able to react if there is a child protection case. Yes. Okay. So that person, it's quite a high stakes role. So you need somebody that's got some gravitas, someone that can actually have those big stakes conversations, but can also look strategically at what are the things that we're doing that could present a challenge, and how can we, one of the essential safeguarding questions we ask is, how might we do this better? And then look at practice and think, oh, that's a challenge. How can we engineer that and make it better so that we can reduce some of the risk of something going wrong with a volunteer and a child, with a teacher and a child?
Dave, this is so powerful. It's so insightful to hear the legal side and the compliance side, which is so important. But as a church, we have to apply to a higher standard, to a kingdom standard.
Yes.
Briefly, as a pastor, one that has been worked in the church, please share some insight from a kingdom perspective on the importance of this particular subject.
Yeah. So, I mean, just to give color to the strength of that pull towards this is, I was involved with full-time ministry and stepped away from that to get involved with safeguarding, because I realized it's such an issue in South Africa. And to answer the question directly, one of the responsibilities I have as a preacher, as a pastor, as somebody who loves Jesus and loves the Father, I have to represent heaven. And in my duty to represent the Father, I feel such a compassion to be actually doing the best I can in that space. So that's why I exited full-time ministry and have gone essentially into the marketplace to do exactly that, to help come alongside Christian organizations and secular schools and say, well, how best can we take care of those in our because essentially those that are given the honor of leading are called to a higher account. And in some ways, I've been called to lead in this space. So I'm incredibly passionate about it, because I have to, at night when I put my head on my pillow, I can say to heaven, I know that we're better because I've engaged in this space. And that for me it's quite a intrinsic motivator to be quite passionate about this in terms of what can we do better, how might we be better as churches, as schools.
Yeah, I mean, God calls us. I remember the one verse of where He calls the children unto Him to take care of the children, and in our space of worship, we have a lot of visitors and children that comes along, and the church needs to be the most safest place for children to experience Jesus and the love of God. And sadly, there has been unfortunate incidents of abuse, sexual abuse of children within the body of Christ. And it's our heart's desire to see best practices being applied, for the fear of God to be upon us as spiritual leaders, to ensure that we do everything from a proactive and a preventative measure to ensure that the Child Protection Act, which is applicable to non-profit companies, which is applicable to non-profit organizations, which is applicable to the education sector, and also to you as the church, to ensure that we comply. In closing, I'm so blessed that we had David read with us. David, I just want to give you this opportunity to share what is the Guardian about and how you as an organization can be of service to them. And at the end of this video presentation, we will provide more details on it. But very briefly, what does the Guardian, what services do they provide to the church, to schools?
Okay, so both schools, churches, and sports organizations. Essentially we work through a lot of different organizations. But to answer the question, we provide that safeguarding or proactive foundation through policy development and in partnership with organizations developing that policy. We train designated safeguarding people who would lead safeguarding within an organization. We have an anonymous reporting app that we make available to organizations that is essentially the whistleblowing mechanism within organizations. Then we also partner in terms of what does communication look like, both in the safeguarding space and the child protection space. Just to give that clarity, the communication piece is not only once we've had an incident, how do we write a press release, but what are we doing to make our place safer? We communicate. That is essential to communicate to the community so that they're on board with any changes that we're making. And then also we do safeguarding awareness workshops. It's something that I probably give about 60% of my time to personally, and that's actually at the moment all over South Africa, much to the challenge of my family life. I'm already in Johannesburg next week doing another course at an organization, but it's very important to have that baseline understanding for all people who are involved in working with children, and that's safeguarding awareness training. And then we also do the background checks. We facilitate that moment through, and we make those requests to the different departments within the government for those, essentially the criminal check, the sexual offenders register, and child protection.
Thank you, Dave. As pastors, we don't need to be experts in this particular area, and that's why the South African Institute for Church Administration has been established to help you to be better at serving the community. The complexity of media policies, photography and video policies, drug and substance abuse policies, and I can go on with this list of compliance. It can be overwhelming. Yeah. And so there are organizations like the Guardian that you can reach out to that will assist you in becoming compliant and ensuring that your children are safe. I thank you so much.